The wind on the Ashenmoor frontier didn't just blow, it remembered. It carried the smell of old fires and older wars. It whispered through the cracked wood of weathered fences and rattled the bones of abandoned watchtowers that had once stood proud against invasions that no longer came. The frontier was a place that the rest of the world had decided to forget, and most of the people who lived there had decided the same about themselves. Mara Coldwell had forgotten herself on purpose. She was 53 years old, built like a woman who had spent 3 decades carrying things that were too heavy: weapons, grief, responsibility, guilt. Her hair had gone completely silver at 40, which she considered a fair trade for still being alive. Her left hand was missing 2 fingers, lost to a blade in the Battle of Dunvale Crossing 20 years ago. Her right hand was steady as iron and twice as hard. She had a farm on the edge of the Ashenmoor. 40 acres of difficult land, most of it good for nothing except growing rocks and silence. She had 2 horses, a gray mare named Bottle and a stubborn brown gelding named Cork, named so because she'd bought them both from a winemaker going bankrupt. She had a dog named Sergeant, who was 14 years old, mostly deaf, and still the most reliable creature she'd ever known. She had no neighbors within 8 miles. She preferred it that way. It was early autumn when it happened, the kind of morning where the mist sits heavy on the ground and everything smells like wet earth and pine resin. Mara was splitting wood behind the farmhouse. She had a rhythm to it. Lift, set, split, stack. Lift, set, split, stack. It was the kind of work that emptied her mind, and she valued emptied minds above almost everything else. Full minds were dangerous. Full minds remembered things. Sergeant lifted his old gray head from his paws. That was the first sign. He couldn't hear much anymore. A thunderstorm barely made him flinch, but he could feel vibrations in the earth better than any creature she'd ever known. His nose twitched. His ears, ragged at the tips from an old encounter with a fence post, rotated forward with an effort that seemed almost painful. Then he growled. Low. Steady. Serious. Mara set down her axe without hurry. She didn't reach for the short sword on the wall hook or the crossbow hanging beside it. She just stood still and listened, the way she'd been taught 30 years ago by a sergeant-at-arms who'd told her, before you react, understand. Dead soldiers react. Survivors understand. She heard it after a moment. Not voices, not exactly. More like the sound of something trying not to make sound. The particular quality of suppressed noise, the creak of cart wheels being pushed slowly, the deliberate silence of people moving through the treeline west of her fence line. Too careful to be innocent. Too slow to be fleeing. She picked up her axe, not as a weapon. It was the wrong tool for a fight, but because she didn't want to leave it lying outside. Old habits. She walked to the farmhouse, hung the axe, took down the crossbow and the short sword, and then went to the front of the house and sat in the wooden chair on the porch like a woman who had absolutely nothing better to do. She waited. They came out of the treeline 40 minutes later. 6 humans and a heavily laden wagon. The wagon was covered with a tarpaulin of oiled canvas, tied down at the corners. It was pulled by 2 thick horses that looked well-fed and well-shod, expensive animals. The men were well-armed, swords and short bows, leather armor with metal reinforcement at the shoulders and chest. Not soldiers. Soldiers moved differently, with discipline or with chaos, depending on their quality. These moved with the comfortable confidence of men who were used to doing things that were technically illegal, but practically unpunished. Hunters. The mercenary kind. Their leader was a tall man with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his right ear to the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent crooked smile that his eyes didn't share. He rode a horse rather than walked. He stopped at her fence line and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. Morning, he said. We're looking for the road to Ketmore. It's 12 miles north, Mara said. You passed it. He glanced at his men, a performance of confusion. These roads all look the same out here. They do, she agreed pleasantly. Until you know them. A pause. He looked at the crossbow resting across her knees, at her steady hands, at her face. She looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman who had absolutely no fear and would like him to understand that quickly so they could both stop wasting time. We'll rest here for a bit if you don't mind, he said. Water our horses. I do mind, she said. Trough's dry. Road's north. His jaw tightened. The easy charm dropped like a mask. Old woman. Veteran. she said calmly. Frontier Guard, 3rd Regiment, 28 years. I've put down 12 men in the line of duty and twice that outside it. I'm going to ask you once to tell me what's in that wagon. Then I'm going to stop asking. Silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. One of his men laughed nervously and stopped. The man with the scar studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, genuinely, this time, which was somehow worse than the false one, and pulled his horse around. He said something to his men in a low voice. The group moved away from the fence, back toward the treeline, taking the wagon with them. Mara watched until they were out of sight. Then she went inside, put on her heavier boots and her riding coat, told Sergeant to stay, and saddled Bottle. She followed them. She knew the Ashenmoor forest better than those men would ever know it. She'd spent years walking every trail, mapping every clearing, learning where the ground went soft and where it held firm. She could move through the undergrowth on horseback in near silence when she wanted to. She wanted to now. She found them in the wide clearing by Ashencroft Brook, a place where the trees thinned out and the ground was flat and solid, a good camp spot. They'd stopped the wagon beside the water and were arguing amongst themselves in the careless way of men who believed they were alone. Mara tied Bottle to a tree 100 yards back and went the rest of the way on foot. From behind a fallen oak at the edge of the clearing, she watched. 2 of the men had pulled back the tarpaulin. What was underneath were cages, iron-barred, built into the wagon bed itself, 3 on each side. The bars were thick and the locks were heavy. 5 of the 6 cages were occupied. She had encountered trolls 3 times in her life, all during her Frontier Guard years. They were nothing like the stories told in cities, where people who had never seen one described monsters of pure savagery. Real trolls were large. These were adults, the biggest perhaps 6.5 feet when standing, with the heavy, gray-green skin and broad features common to their kind. They had the characteristic ridge brows and the strong, wide hands. Their eyes, in the dim light under the canvas that had covered them, were adjusting slowly, amber gold and blinking. They were shackled inside the cages with chains at the wrists and ankles. They had wounds, not fresh, but not properly healed. Someone had been keeping them alive and injured. Easier to manage. They were a family. She could see it immediately, with the pattern-reading eye that 28 years of frontier work had given her. The way they oriented toward each other. The way the largest, a female, she thought, with braided gray-streaked hair, positioned herself closest to the smallest, a young troll who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old in troll reckoning, curled in the corner of the cage with its eyes squeezed shut. The men were debating loudly about payment and route. Vortex contact in the city wants them alive and in one piece. One of them was saying, "We push through tonight. The young one's going to die before we reach the city if we don't give it water," another said. "Look at it. Not our problem if it dies. We get paid for what we deliver." Mara lay behind the fallen oak for a long time. She was 53 years old. She had come to the Ashenmoor frontier specifically to stop doing things like this. She had debts she'd spent years trying to pay down by leaving the world alone, by not inserting herself into things that weren't her problem. The young troll in the cage made a sound, barely audible, just a small, broken exhalation. She closed her eyes. "Sergeant," she thought, "you would hate this." She was already calculating. 6 men, 5 armed with swords and short bows. 1, the leader, with a sword and a long knife. All in armor. 1 woman, 53, with a crossbow that held 2 bolts, a short sword, a belt knife, and 28 years of experience in situations that were supposed to be impossible. The favorable variables, they didn't know she was here. They were relaxed, careless, arguing. The clearing had good sight lines for her, but poor ones for them. She could move around the perimeter without being seen. The 2 horses hitched to the wagon were a potential resource. The unfavorable variables, 6 is a large number. Crossbow gives her 2 shots before she has to reload, and reload takes time. The cages were locked, and she didn't have the keys. She spent 10 minutes working it out. Then she stopped working it out and let instinct take over, because instinct, she had learned long ago, was just experience compressed into reflex. She moved left, staying low, circling to the far side of the clearing. She found a position behind a cluster of birch trees where she had a clean line to the wagon and 3 of the men. She loaded both bolts. She took 3 slow breaths. The man with the scar was standing by the brook, talking to two of his companions, their backs partially toward her. The other three were on the wagon side of the clearing, one of them fiddling with a cage lock, the other two passing a water flask. She shot the man on the right end of the broker group first, the one closest to a short bough propped against a tree. He went down hard and didn't get up. The second bolt took the one reaching for that short bough before his fingers closed on it. She was already moving, dropping the crossbow and drawing the short sword, crossing the 20 yards to the wagon in the time it took the remaining 4 men to understand what was happening. The leader was fast. She'd expected that, had accounted for it. He had his sword out before she reached the wagon and came at her with real skill, controlled and economical. She took a cut on her left forearm that would need stitching and gave him 3 in return, none decisive, backing him up. He was better than her in raw technical terms, younger, with 2 good hands. But she'd been fighting in bad situations her whole adult life, and there is a quality that comes from fighting in bad situations that cannot be learned from training. It is a specific, cold quality of not minding that things are going badly, because going badly is just the current condition and conditions change if you keep working. She took the cut. She gave the 3. She made him back up. She put him between herself and the wagon, which put 2 of his men behind him with no clean angle, and she kept moving, constantly, because standing still was for people who had better odds than she did. It took 11 minutes. When it was over, 2 men were unconscious, 2 were down for good, and the leader and 1 other had run hard into the forest, abandoning the wagon, the horses, and everything else. She stood in the clearing breathing hard, blood running warm down her left arm, listening to the forest sounds settle back to normal. The large troll in the nearest cage was watching her. Amber gold eyes. Absolutely steady. The keys were on the leader's belt, which meant he'd taken them with him. She searched the 2 unconscious men and found nothing useful for the cages. She searched the wagon storage box and found a spare key ring, different keys, wagon storage, horse tackle. She sat on the wagon board and thought carefully. The cage locks were good quality iron, not exceptional. A crowbar or a wedge, properly applied to the hinge side rather than the lock side, had a reasonable chance. It would take time and effort. She had time. She had effort. She talked while she worked, because silence in a situation like this was its own kind of pressure, and she didn't want the trolls to feel more pressured than they already were. "I'm Mara Coldwell," she said, addressing the large female who had remained watching her throughout. "I live on the farm to the east. I'm going to get these open. It'll take a while. I'd appreciate it if none of you tried to kill me when they're open. I understand that's not guaranteed given current circumstances, but I consider it a personal favor." The troll said nothing, but her expression changed, barely, just a slight shift in the set of her brow ridge, in a way that Mara, who was good at reading faces, read as, acknowledged. She found a short-handled crowbar in the wagon toolkit. She started with the cage holding the smallest troll, the child, because the child had the most urgent look of distress. She worked the crowbar into the gap between hinge plate and cage bar, leaned her weight on it, felt the metal protest, leaned harder. The hinge popped on the 3rd sustained push. The cage door swung inward. The child didn't move, just looked at her with enormous amber eyes full of a wariness that no child of any species should have in its eyes. "It's all right," Mara said softly. "You can come out when you're ready." She moved to the next cage. It took an hour and a quarter to open all 5. By the end her left arm had stiffened around the cut, and her back ached, and her hands were scraped raw from the crowbar work. She sat on the ground by the brook and washed the cut on her arm in the cold water, which helped with neither the pain nor her dignity, and watched the 5 trolls emerge into the open air of the clearing. The shackles were another problem. She didn't have a key for those either, and the locks were heavier. She found a hammer and a cold chisel in the wagon toolkit and spent another 40 minutes working through each set, the trolls sitting still with a patience that moved her in a way she hadn't expected to be moved. The large female held the child's shackled wrists so they didn't move while Mara worked the chisel, and the steadiness of those big gray-green hands was something Mara would remember for years. When the last shackle came free, the clearing was quiet. 5 trolls stood in the autumn light. The large female, an equally large male who moved stiffly from an injury to his left leg, 2 younger adults who might have been grown children of the older pair, and the child. They had the bruised and careful look of creatures who had been confined for too long. The child flexed its newly freed hands slowly, opening and closing them, as if rediscovering a fact it had almost forgotten. Mara gathered the crowbar, the hammer, the chisel, and put them back in the wagon toolkit. Then she looked at the 5 of them and said, "There's water in the brook. Take the water. Take anything in the wagon you need. I'd suggest heading northwest. The territory north of the Ashenmoor is less patrolled, and the terrain will cover you better." She started gathering up her crossbow from where she'd dropped it earlier. "Coldwell." She turned. The large female had spoken, a low, carefully formed word. Mara's name made slightly different by a voice and mouth built differently from a human one, but unmistakable. Mara looked at her. The troll looked back. Then she put her right hand flat over her chest, over her heart, and inclined her head. It was the simplest possible gesture, and it was enough. She rode back to the farm in the early afternoon with the cut on her arm stitched shut with her own field kit and the peculiar emptiness in her chest that always followed action, the place where the adrenaline had been before it drained away. Sergeant was waiting on the porch. He wagged his old tail when she came up the path, slow but sincere. "Quiet day," she told him, settling into her chair. She sat for a while watching the mist clear off the moor. The light came through the treeline in long yellow shafts, the kind of autumn light that made everything look like a painting of itself. A hawk circled over the far field. Cork and bottle were visible in the paddock, undisturbed. She thought about the leader with the scar. He'd gone east, toward Ketmore, and she thought he probably wouldn't come back. Men like that had other jobs, other contracts, and the cost-benefit of returning to deal with one-armed old woman on a farm wasn't favorable. But she'd reinforced the fence on the west side anyway. Old habits. She thought about the family in the forest, moving northwest through the trees with their freed hands and their watchful eyes. She hoped the terrain held for them. She hoped the autumn held a little longer. The early frost would make travel hard, and the youngest was small. She thought, not for the first time and not with any resolution, about all the things she'd done in 28 years that she was less proud of than today. That was a long and complicated list. Today wasn't on it. After a while she went inside and started water heating for tea. The first snow came 3 weeks later. Mara had spent those 3 weeks reinforcing the west fence, restocking her crossbow bolts, and doing the 100 autumnal tasks of a frontier farm: preserving, stacking, patching, preparing. The arm healed cleanly. Sergeant developed a new habit of sleeping closer to the door, which she interpreted as solidarity. On the morning of the first snow, she woke before light to find Sergeant sitting up alert, his nose working hard. She dressed without hurry and went to the front door. On the porch, set neatly to the left of the door so it wouldn't be missed, were 5 objects, 4 good-sized blocks of what she recognized as cured ironwood, the dense, fire-slow-burning wood that the northern troll communities harvested and prepared in a specific way she'd read about years ago, each block marked with a small carved symbol she didn't know. And beside them, a carved figure, simple, done in gray stone, about the length of her hand. A person, standing upright. At the base of it, a few carved marks. She picked up the stone figure and stood in the snow light of early morning looking at it for a long time. She couldn't read troll script. She didn't know what the marks said, but she thought she understood. She went inside and put it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where it stayed. The winter passed the way frontier winters passed, long and white and full of small battles against the cold that you fought one day at a time and tried not to dramatize. Sergeant made it through. She'd worried, that autumn, that he wouldn't. He was 14 and slow and mostly deaf, and sometimes confused about where he was for a moment before his nose sorted things out. But he made it through with the particular dignity of very old dogs, which is not a diminished dignity, but a different and specific one. Spring came in March, aggressive and muddy. The moor turned from white to brown to, eventually, the pale green of new grass. The birds came back in their argumentative thousands. On a warm day in April, Mara was doing the season's first work on the east field when she heard Sergeant's alert sound. Not a growl this time, a different quality. She turned from the field. At the tree line, watching her from the shadow of the pines, were 5 trolls. She recognized the female immediately. The broad face, the braided gray-streaked hair, the amber-gold eyes. She was upright, moving freely, the injury she'd had in the cage apparently healed. The child was beside her and had grown, or seemed to have grown, or perhaps just seemed different without the weight of confinement. Mara set down her spade and straightened up. The female walked forward into the field without hurry. She carried something. Mara saw it as she got closer. A bundle of young plants, roots still dirt-heavy, that Mara recognized as wild heartsalve. A plant that grew in the Northern Territories, and that was, she knew from her frontier years, extraordinarily difficult to transplant and almost impossible to cultivate outside its native ground. Frontier herbalists had been trying for generations. The female set the bundle down in front of her on the cleared earth. Then she did something else. She reached into the carrying pouch at her belt and took out a second stone figure, this one slightly different from the first, more detailed, she thought, more personal. She held it out. Mara took it, looked at it. Then she looked at the female. Mara had never learned her name and wasn't sure of the protocol for asking, so she'd simply thought of her, privately, as the matriarch, which felt right. The matriarch looked back, and then, slowly, with the particular precision of someone who has learned a few words of a second language and wants very much to use them correctly, she said, "Thank you, Coldwell." 3 words. Said carefully. Said exactly right. Mara felt something shift in her chest, an old weight, familiar enough to be almost unnoticeable, the kind of weight you forget you're carrying until the moment something lifts it. She took a breath, nodded. "You're welcome," she said. "Come back anytime." The heartsalve took root in the East Field. This was considered, by the 3 frontier herbalists who eventually heard about it and came to see it, to be completely impossible. They asked Mara how she'd done it. She told them she'd just put it in the ground and kept the deer off it, which was the truth, and which they refused to believe, because impossible things require complicated explanations. The stone figure on the mantelpiece, the first one, she eventually found out from a wandering scholar who had some knowledge of troll cultural traditions that the marks at the base were not words exactly, but a type of declaration, a marking of debt acknowledged and relationship established. The kind of mark that troll communities put on locations they considered under their protection. The scholar said it was exceptional to have one. He said only very specific people received them. Mara put the second figure beside the first one on the mantelpiece and didn't tell anyone else about it. Sargent died in late summer of that year, on a warm evening, on the porch, looking out at the moor with the peaceful expression of a dog that has finished its business and found it satisfactory. She buried him at the edge of the East Field and put a flat stone over him and thought about all the versions of herself he had witnessed, and was glad he had witnessed them. She got another dog in autumn, a young border sheepdog, black and white, absurdly energetic, apparently unaware that the farm didn't actually have any sheep. She named him Private, which she thought Sargent would have found appropriate. The mercenaries never came back. The leader with the scar was reported, some months later, to have been arrested in a city 300 miles away on an unrelated matter. She heard this from a passing trader and felt neither satisfaction nor relief, just the neutral fact of a situation resolved by someone else's justice rather than her own, which was, she thought, probably how it should be. The frontier stayed what it always was, difficult, quiet, unglamorous, full of small battles and occasional moments that made you remember why you'd chosen to stay. Every spring after that, something new appeared on her porch. A bundle of herbs. A piece of worked stone. Once, inexplicably, a section of carved wood that turned out, when she had it looked at, to be a detailed map of the Northern Forest Territory with all the soft ground marked in a different color, the most practical and generous gift she'd ever received. She added each thing to the farm in whatever way made sense. The map went on the wall beside the door. The herbs went into the East Field alongside the heartsalve. The figures stayed on the mantelpiece. She was 53 years old when it began, and 54 when she understood what it was. Not a story about rescue, not a story about heroism, not even really a story about her. It was a story about what happens when 2 kinds of people, who have both spent too long being afraid of the world, discover in one muddy autumn clearing that the world is slightly less dangerous than they thought, and decide, quietly, without ceremony, to prove it.